What is up, guys? Blue Spooky here with the Wednesday 2-hour Megamix. That is 2 hours of new true scary stories to this channel, as much as I'm able to track. If you guys enjoy this long video, please be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you feel so inclined. Doing all of those ensures I can keep making daily videos for a long time to come, especially these longer ones. If you guys have any thoughts about the stories in this video, please be sure to leave them in the comments below, as one of my favorite parts about doing this is reading your guys' comments, even if I don't always get the chance to reply to them. Without further ado though, guys, I will let you enjoy the next 2 hours of true scary stories, and I will see you again at the end of the video. Thanks for watching. A little bit of background about me, so you can understand where I'm coming from when I tell you I resorted to bar hopping to find love. I was born and raised in a small town in Kansas that I was dying to get away from. Pretty much since the moment I was able to speak, there was never anything to do, and the boys there never really liked me either. I've never been conventionally pretty or attractive in any way that would catch attention. I moved out of Kansas to New York City in 2008. When I was around 18, I wanted to pursue fashion. At that time, I thought I would have no problem meeting someone in a city as big as that one, but let me tell you, it was still very hard. It almost seemed like I was invisible, like even if I was in a crowded room, I was still somehow invisible to everyone there. After months of feeling sad and alone, I decided a decent place to meet people was at the bar. The first few weeks, I was too nervous to talk to anyone, but eventually I was able to take a deep breath and start some conversations. The only problem was, it seemed like all any guy wanted there was a quick hookup. I guess I can't act all that surprised though. Until one guy. He was in his early 30s or so, with me only having recently turned 21. I figured this gave me an end to a more adult-like relationship. He was tall and muscular, probably around 6'1" or so. He was so far out of my league that I was confused why he even began talking to me to begin with. For the sake of this story, we'll call him Jake. Jake texted me the same night we had met, and immediately started showering me with all these compliments. He told me I was gorgeous. He didn't understand why I didn't have people lined up to be with me. I should have seen right through the flattery. But I'd never received that kind of attention before. It made me feel good in a time in my life where all I felt was sadness. He would text and call me every day for weeks on end, just to tell me how amazing I was and how much he wanted to see me again. He said he was out of town for the next month though. Had some business to attend to upstate. By the time the month had gone by though, Jake was still there, texting and calling me just as much, so we made a plan to hang out at the same place where we first met. He told me he would take care of everything. When he picked me up, he hugged me and opened the door for me, while again showering me with compliments and telling me we were going to have so much fun. He shut the door behind me and climbed into the driver's seat, pulling into what seemed like it would be endless traffic. After around 10 minutes in the car with him, his demeanor started to change. He started to act real nervous. He pulled up to the same bar and he paid for the valet. We walked inside, and he led us to a table pretty far toward the back of the bar, where a woman was there waiting for us already. I was so confused. I turned over to Jake. "That can't be our table, right?" He assured me it was. I was even more confused when he went and sat down next to the woman, asking me to sit across from them. I sat down, not really sure what to make of this. Then, the woman started talking to me. She told me how excited she was to finally meet me, and that Jake had told me so much about me. I just ended up blurting out in confusion, "Who are you?" I remember her laughing a little and whispering to Jake, "Oh, I like this one." She told me she was in charge of an outreach program for what she said was a sanctuary for people not sure about where their life was going. Jake had told her how insecure and unsure I was about myself, and she could help me. All I needed to do was trust her. She would take me to their little farm upstate, and I would have no contact with what she said was the toxic world outside. I remember getting annoyed at how much she used the word sanctuary over and over. I asked her how specifically she could help me, and she told me the only way to really live a happy life was to cut out all contact from the outside world. That way, there would be nothing to drag me down or make me sad anymore. The entire conversation, she was eyeing me all over like she was judging me. She said if I joined them, I would never have to feel alone again. The world was such a cruel place after all, but with them it didn't have to be. Now, I might have been somewhat young, but I could spot a cult from a mile away. I told her I would think about it, but I wanted to go home first. They offered to drive me home, but I assured them a taxi would be fine. I just wanted to get as far away from them as possible. The next few weeks were quite strange. I would get all these letters left on my doorstep at all times of the day, telling me to meet them back at the bar and join them. They also said that they were always watching me, that they cared so much about me. I had no idea why they were so persistent. I tried to continue ignoring their letters and messages, and eventually, after a few years, they stopped. The feeling of being watched, though, never really went away. I passed by that same bar many times in the past decade since, and once in a while I'll see that exact same woman sitting at the very same table with an older man and a younger girl just like I was. All I can hope is that they don't fall for the trap they're setting up for them, the trap they once tried to set up for me. I'm a 26-year-old guy and I'm relatively laid back. I mind my own business and I've never really been interested in socializing too much. I like my privacy, and keeping to myself has always seemed to work out just fine in my life. I really, and I mean really, wanted to see the Grand Canyon though, ever since I was a little kid. I wanted to go so bad, but keeping to myself for so long also meant I didn't have many friends. The friends I did have weren't all that interested in a road trip to the Grand Canyon, so I decided to go all by myself. Only I took a plane instead. Road trips are only really fun when you're with another person. This was just over a year ago, and at that time, I honestly never even thought of telling anyone that I was even leaving. I touched down in Flagstaff and I was so excited. I picked up my rental car and made my way to my hotel. The plan was to spend a day or two hanging out in the city, then a few days during the weekend exploring the Grand Canyon. By the time I checked into the hotel and got to my room, it was only around 3 p.m. or so. I watched the TV for a few hours, but decided I wanted to go out and see what the city had to offer. I was still alone though, so the initial awkwardness I felt was really intense. I just kept trying to tell myself to get out of my comfort zone and try to have a good time at least. When I stepped into the lobby, I noticed the woman who checked me in hours before was just leaving. She was around my age, so I figured she might know some places to go that might be fun. I walked up to her and tried to ask her for some tips for the area. She was really nice actually, and offered to show me around the city, maybe even take me to a few of the local bars she thought were worth going to. It seemed like a good plan, and she seemed nice enough. The first bar we went to was quite fun actually. It had more of a nightclub vibe, but I was feeling it. After a few drinks, I started to loosen up and actually enjoy the time I was having. The lady seemed like she was having a lot of fun too. We went to another bar around a couple of hours after that, and that's when the night started to really go downhill. As we walked inside, immediately the girl started acting very differently. She grabbed under my arm and kept rubbing herself up against me. I was pretty drunk at that point, and I thought she was too. Maybe she was even a little into me. She pulled me towards a table and we ordered some more drinks. She was laughing at everything I said, and let me tell you, that was a big ego boost. I started to really like this girl. And that's when I saw this big guy and his friends all walking straight towards us. He immediately grabbed me by the collar of my shirt and loudly asked me where I got off on touching his girl like that. I was pretty drunk at this point and very confused. I must have sounded like a complete idiot trying to explain the situation to him. He kept asking the same question over and over again until I finally felt myself being dragged across the bar and then outside. There was an alley beside it where I was shoved to the ground. The guy and his friends proceeded to kick me in the ribs more times than I can count, especially in the state I was already in. After a few kicks to the face and a few broken teeth later, he told me to never talk to his girlfriend again, and if I did, there would be further consequences. He spit in my face, and I laid there until I blacked out. Soon after, I woke up the next morning in that same alley, in agonizing pain. I could only remember bits and pieces of the night before, but I distinctly remember what the hotel girl had put me through. She'd used me to make her boyfriend jealous, and clearly didn't care at all about what would happen to me in the process. I picked myself up off the ground and ordered an Uber back to my hotel. After what happened the night before, I figured it might be best to switch hotels altogether. I didn't want another run-in with this guy who just beat me senseless. I took a shower, packed my bags, and hobbled out to my car while wincing in the pain of my injuries. I got out of there as quickly as possible and made it to my new hotel. I remember sighing in relief that I'd never have to see those guys ever again. I checked in, and when I got to my room, basically passed out from pure exhaustion. Throughout the night, though, I could have sworn I heard light knocking on the hotel room door. I chalked it up to possibly hearing something from down the hall, but the door handle would also jiggle here and there. I made excuses for it in my mind. Maybe it was just housekeeping, right? This continued for the next couple of days and nights that I spent resting in that room. There was one morning even when I woke up and the door was slightly ajar, only caught by the security chain. That freaked me out quite a bit, but again, I thought it must have been housekeeping trying to get in during the night to clean. I woke up at 8 a.m. Saturday morning and was super excited to finally see the Grand Canyon in person after wanting to for so long. There was still a faint taste of blood in my mouth, but I finally started to feel better, and the pain had begun to subside. I figured it was now or never. I got dressed and put sunscreen over my massive throbbing bruises and made my way out of the hotel in the parking lot toward the car. Except in the parking lot where my car should have been was instead a mangled mess of metal that had once been the rental car I'd parked there a couple of days before. All the windows were smashed, the headlights were broken, and the doors and windshield looked like they had been beaten in with crowbars or sledgehammers or something. I was shocked and scared. I didn't know what to do. I ended up calling the police and filing reports, but nothing came of it. The girl at the hotel denied everything and even claimed to not be in a relationship with anyone at all. Thankfully, I had an insurance plan for the rental car, so the damage was covered. But I did have to fork over $6,000 to fix my teeth. I spent that one day at the Grand Canyon Tourist Center because I knew I couldn't afford to come back anytime soon. To be completely honest, I didn't really want to come back. I was terrified of that place now. It really sucked how the one time I tried to come out of my shell, it ended in disaster and disappointment. My only advice for people who romanticize traveling alone is don't. My girlfriend and I had just gotten engaged, and we wanted to take a short road trip to celebrate. It was something we'd been thinking about doing for quite a while, but with work and trying to find somewhere to house our pets during the short trip, we just never actually got around to doing it. Finally though, during spring of 2019, we made some concrete plans. We figured we would drive from Southern California where we lived to Western Montana. My mom and dad had moved to Montana after retiring, so we figured it would be the perfect place to drive to. They'd been begging us to visit for a while anyway. We mapped out the whole drive and decided on a more scenic route up the 101 North, then eventually passing through Oregon, Washington, and Idaho to get to Montana. What we hadn't been expecting, though, was to not even make it halfway until we got the fright of our lives. The night before we left, we spent packing and talking about how excited we were to actually be getting on vacation. We decided to leave pretty early the next morning to try and get as far as possible. Driving during the night wasn't something either of us wanted to be doing. We packed our car with our bags, then dropped off our dogs at our friend's house. We made sure to tell multiple close friends and family members where we were going to, how exactly we were getting there, how long we'd be there, just in case something were to happen. We weren't planning for such an event to happen, but you hear stories all the time about people who could have been saved if people knew where they were going to be, or how long they were going to be gone. We didn't want to be one of those people. At the time, I was about 29 or so. I'm 6'4" and I pretty regularly attend the gym. I'm not a small guy by any means. My fiance, on the other hand, was 23 and really tiny, just under 5 feet or so. She always said that having me around made her feel much safer in a world where vulnerable people are often preyed upon. After dropping our dogs off at our friend's house, we started the long drive. We made some casual stops along the way, too. First, in a small city about an hour into the trip called Camarillo, we got some snacks and drinks, then hopped back into the car and went on our way. The drive along the California coastline is one I'd recommend to everyone. It's an absolutely gorgeous sight. In fact, my fiance kept begging me to pull over to get some pictures, so we weren't making it as far as we'd originally planned for our first day of driving. What should have taken us about 6 hours to get to San Jose eventually took 10. We got off the freeway and the sun was already starting to set. I was tired and I knew we didn't want to drive at night, so we settled on finding a place to eat and looking for a hotel. We drove by a sports bar and agreed this would be a fine enough place to stop by. We were both really tired at this point and eager to get out of the car and eat some real food, not just chips and soda. We pulled into the parking lot when the first thing I noticed was a large pickup truck parked right out front. There were only a few other cars in the lot. We took that as a good sign though, thinking the place wouldn't be too packed and we'd be able to get our food faster. We hopped out of the car and quickly locked it behind us before we walked inside. I quickly realized though this wasn't your typical fun-loving football night sort of sports bar. It was a locals-only spot. From the second we walked in, it felt like every pair of eyes in the building snapped right onto us. Not just because new people had walked in, but because outsiders had walked in. It had the same vibe as accidentally stumbling upon a major drug deal. The bar itself wasn't too nice either. You know the saying, never judge a book by its cover? Well, think that, but backwards. The outside said fun and inviting atmosphere within, but the inside said grab your stuff and don't look anyone in the eyes or else you'll get stabbed. We sat down in the far corner and checked out the very short menu. It consisted of nachos and hot dogs, and to be honest, we both had started to feel our appetites disappearing by the second. We were sitting directly next to a window where we could see our car. Two men that were hanging out at the bar began whispering while glancing in our direction. I couldn't push away the uneasy feeling in my stomach, telling me we needed to get out of there as soon as possible. Just when I was about to say we needed to leave though, the two men I mentioned walked out of the bar. I started to feel a little better, but I still really wanted to leave. I could tell by the look on my fiance's face they did too. I shook my head to say let's go, when she looked at me with this look I'll never forget. She motioned to look out the window. When I looked outside, I saw the same two men grab a bat and a crowbar from the trunk of their large pickup truck, then head towards our car and begin looking inside. I quickly whispered to my fiancé to come with me to the bathroom immediately. She didn't question me and did exactly what I told her. It was a huge relief in such a situation. We got in the bathroom and locked the door behind us, looking for any window we could make our escape through. We opened stall after stall, but there was nothing we could find. The last stall, though, actually had a tiny window placed just above the toilet. The only problem was there was no way I was going to fit. I made the quickest plan in my head. It was really the only option we had. I gave my fiancée the keys to the car and told her to climb outside and approach the car once the guys had gone. I told her the second she got inside to start it and meet me at the back entrance, which was only a few feet from the bathroom door we'd just entered. In retrospect, maybe we should have just gone out the back entrance to begin with, but I was a little distracted at the time. She slipped through the window, and just as she was turning the corner, she saw the guys go back inside. I slightly opened the bathroom door and saw the guys were now questioning the other people at the bar. The weird part was that nobody was even fazed by these two men with a bat and crowbar standing directly next to them, like this was some sort of regular occurrence or something. Suddenly, a person they were talking to pointed directly at the bathroom door. I knew they saw me when they started running towards me, weapons raised and shouting at me to stay right where I was. I opened the door as fast as I could, though, and was on the back exit within seconds. Thankfully, my fiancée was there in the car waiting for me. Let me tell you, I've never jumped in a vehicle that fast in my life. She started speeding away before the door was even shut. The men had just gotten outside when we were pulling out of the parking lot. Their shouts were drowned out by the distance growing between us. The whole situation was just so incredibly fast, bizarre, and traumatizing. My fiancé and I actually turned around and drove all the way back home. We felt we were safer in our own hometown than on the road for another 2 days. Paranoid something like this would happen again. All I can say is that if you're ever in an area that you don't know, maybe be a little bit more cautious than we were that night. It all started when I woke up to the sound of someone hammering on my apartment door. That was only the first fright I got that night, though. Heart pounding in my chest, I grabbed the bat I kept underneath my bed and headed towards my door. The first thing I did was look through the peephole to make sure it was not anyone sketchy. I was surprised when I was greeted by the sight of one of my neighbors. She looked completely terrified, and she was covered in blood too. I could already see through the peephole that her face was a mess. As I opened the door, she ran inside and started begging with me. "You gotta get me out of here. My boyfriend is trying to kill me." I asked her what happened, and she just interrupted me and said something like, "There's no time. Please, just get me out of here. I swear to God, he'll kill you too just for helping me." That was what sent me into a straight-up panic, because if this guy was willing to beat up his girlfriend that badly, Lord knows what he'd be willing to do to me. I grabbed my car keys, ran downstairs with the girl following close behind, jumped into my car, and took off into the night. I remember asking her if she had anywhere I could take her, like a friend's or a relative's or something. She said no, and the best thing for us to do would be to drive to a motel so she could call the cops from there. That's exactly what I did. I drove us to a motel and booked a room as well. The clerk was obviously just as concerned as I was. All it took was to explain that her boyfriend had tried to offer, and they immediately suggested we call the cops right away. The girl, whose name I didn't know at this point, I just knew her as the neighbor, said she'd go up to the room and call them. Then asked me to get her some ice from the ice machine so she could deal with the swelling on her face. When I got to the room, she said the cops would be there ASAP. She took the ice, put it on her face, and burst into tears. I tried my best to reassure her, telling her she was safe and all that sort of stuff. When she finally calmed down, I asked her what had happened back at her apartment. She told me her boyfriend was abusive, and she'd been planning on leaving for a while. That night, she'd finally got the courage to announce it to him. She said he walked into their bedroom to find her packing a bag, and not long after that, everything went to chaos. She started helping herself to the little bottle of liqueur from the minibar, but not after promising she'd pay me back for everything once this had all blown over. I had no reason to disbelieve her at the time. I mean, I felt we had kind of established a bond of some sorts. I abstained from drinking myself, though, because I thought I'd be driving back to the apartment pretty soon. I asked her if she was good to wait on her own while the cops drove out to her, but she asked if I'd stay and keep her safe. She also made the point that if her boyfriend found that blood on my apartment door, he'd know she'd been there and try to attack me or worse. To be honest, I thought it was a pretty good point at the time. I hadn't seen the blood myself, but she was so covered in it I just believed her when she said some had to be on my door. About an hour goes by and the cops still haven't shown up yet though. The motel rooms were arranged in a horseshoe shape, so we'd have seen them rolling into the parking lot if they had. I asked her to call them back to see what was going on. Obviously, this was a really urgent situation. I know there's basically no way for the boyfriend to find us, but I was really paranoid that he would figure it out somehow. That's when the inconsistency started though. She gave me some lame duck of a reply like, "I'm sure they'll be here soon." If that was me, I'd have called 911 again if they hadn't shown up in 10 minutes. So why was she so calm about this now? She was just completely cool with waiting for them for like an hour at this point. I put down the booze. It wasn't like I had anywhere to be. I sure couldn't just go back to my apartment with a psycho supposedly a few doors down. That's also about the same time, though, that I started checking out the amount of blood on her nightshirt. She had an oversized t-shirt and girls' boxers on. Like I said earlier, they were drenched with blood, but I also noticed some blood splattered too, little spots here and there. She had this cut over her eye and a nasty busted lip, but this was way too much blood for small wounds like those. I asked her if she had any other kind of injuries. Maybe an abdominal wound of some kind out of sight that might account for all this blood. She said no, and that it was all from that busted lip in her eye. I started to smell the nonsense. I asked her again what exactly had happened back in that apartment. She started getting weirdly defensive at this point. I was starting to think the abusive spouse story she told me the first time around was a little bit strange. I had no inkling of what was really going on though. That being said, I was tired of waiting for the cops to show, so I decided to call them back myself. All I had on me was my wallet, my phone, and my car keys, the only 3 things I'd had time to stuff into my pockets before fleeing. When I took out my phone to call the cops, she immediately interrupted me. "What are you doing?" I stated the obvious. I was about to call the cops back. She became very frantic. I don't know if it was the way she was looking at me, the way she spoke, or the way she immediately tensed up when I told her I was about to do that, but the mood in the room shifted completely. I asked her why not, and went back to dialing 911. At the same time the operator spoke down the line, I looked up and saw she had a knife in her hand. "Hang up now!" I did so. I'd never had a knife pulled on me at that point, and I can't overstate how terrifying it was. It wasn't even just the knife either. It was the overwhelming creepy sensation of knowing that all wasn't what it seemed. I wasn't hiding from the threat. I was with the threat. I'll be honest here, I basically begged her not to hurt me. To my relief, she promised she wouldn't as long as I drove her down to the Canadian border. Given this was in Detroit, the border wasn't all that far away. I didn't want to catch charges for aiding and abetting or whatever though, so I knew I had to think of something to stop this from happening. It's not like I couldn't tell the cops I'd been threatened or whatever, but I also knew the longer I spent in this person's company, the more chances I'd have of being stabbed. I told the girl I'd drive her down, but I needed to get something to eat first. I played it like I wanted to stop somewhere along the way, knowing she'd reason me down to getting something delivered from a 24-hour joint. She also stated she'd be the one going down to pick up the food, as she didn't want me having the chance to sound the alarm. That's where she messed up though. She didn't seem to realize, to my infinite belief, that I could order from DoorDash and put something in the notes as well. I put a note in the order about needing the driver to call the cops for an emergency. My whole plan hinged on the driver reading this, but thank God they did. I was even able to show her the order without bringing up the notes section that mentioned needing 911 immediately. The cops played it perfectly too. They showed up without any lights or sirens on, didn't park in the lot, and walked up to the motel room without being spotted from the window. Then they knocked on the door, just like they were a delivery driver. When she walked over to open it up, boom, they had a gun and taser drawn on her before she even knew what was happening. She had the knife tucked in the back of her boxers, but the cops were wise to her drawing on them. She hit the floor hard after they slammed her with the taser. Turns out they'd been looking for her because she was the abusive partner who'd stabbed her boyfriend almost to death before finding some poor schmuck, i.e. me, to drive her down to the border. The dude had almost bled to death in their shared apartment, but managed to crawl to another neighbor's place to get help. You should have seen the sheer amount of blood in the hallway when I got back to my building. The whole place was crawling with cops in forensic gear. I thought I might have to drive over to a friend's place to stay the night, but they had that section of the corridor closed off, so I could still get to where I lived. The cops came to my apartment in the morning to take my statement down and fill me in with what had happened. That's how I found out exactly what the deal was. This was 100% the craziest and most frightening thing that's ever happened to me in my life. Just the fact I was part of something like this seems completely surreal to me. The thing that sticks out to me the most is how easily I swallowed her nonsense story at first. How I thought I was helping someone I knew, someone I could trust, when in reality, one wrong move and I might not be around to tell you all of this. When I was back in college, I used to work nights at my uncle's motel, just outside of Baton Rouge. It was a pretty sweet gig for the most part. I was already a total night owl during the summers anyway, so instead of just staying home with my parents and getting on their nerves, being bored stiff during the midnight hours, I got to watch movies, read comic books, order takeout, and get paid for the whole damn thing. I remember those times with tons of nostalgia, to be honest, but every so often, I think about this one night where I happened upon one of the creepiest things I've ever seen. It might also even be the creepiest thing I'd ever heard of, too, mainly because of what it entailed and how many unanswered questions it left me with. It started with the motel's fire alarm going off. The fire alarm automatically alerted the fire department, so officially speaking, all they had to do was make sure all the guests evacuated properly. Unofficially, though, it was always an unwritten rule that whoever was on duty would try their damnedest to put out the fire before the whole frickin' place burned down. So that's exactly what I did. Once I saw the smoke billowing out of one of the rooms, I ran right there with my fire extinguisher. I kicked open the door and was relieved when I saw the fire appeared to basically be only in one small area in the corner of the room. I let rip on that thing with my extinguisher. Within a couple of seconds, the fire was out and I'd saved the day. Obviously, I hadn't paid much attention to what else was going on in the room, and the fact that there was no one in it didn't really faze me. I figured they had evacuated like everyone else. My uncle had already been alerted of the fire, and he was ringing the motel's phone like crazy. Boy, did I feel like a real hero, telling him I'd basically saved his entire income by putting out the fire before it could spread. He asked me to check on the actual damage before the fire department showed, which was going to take a while. Hence why he always asked me to be Johnny on the spot with an extinguisher if there was ever a fire. So I did as I was told, heading back up to the room while reassuring the parking lot's congregation of guests that everything was perfectly fine. The fire was already out. It was only when I got back to the room that I realized this fire appeared to have been set in one of the small metal trash cans in each room. Somebody had obviously filled the thing with God knows what, then set the thing on fire before trying to flee. About that moment, I was thinking, well, why the hell would someone do that? As I looked around the environment more, I realized that someone had arranged a bunch of stuff around this room. It was all clothes, all kids' clothes. Interspersed among them were a bunch of what looked like child's drawings. When I checked out what the drawings were of, I realized it was not just the fire department that should be on their way. The cops needed to get here too. The drawings were all of kids in cages, sad or crying, with big angry-looking grown-ups towering over them. Another was what seemed to be a kid crying over a dead child, while the people around them laughed. They were so horrific that despite the heat and smoke still circulating in the room, I felt a chill go down my spine. I immediately went to call the cops, then checked who was booked into the room, and most importantly, if there were any children booked in there too. There was just one guy's name in there, Cameron Odell. So what was this lone guy doing with all these child's clothes? The drawings were already horrifying, but it wasn't out of the question that an adult could have drawn them for whatever reason. The clothes, though, those were a different story. Right after the fire department arrived and they were checking the room over to confirm it was safe for the other guests to head back to theirs, I asked the group of guests in the parking lot if there was a Cameron Odell among them. No one spoke up or raised a hand, and no one by that name or any other name booked another room after everything died down. I'm guessing whoever was calling themselves by that name, probably a fake one, had already long fled following the fire. The cops showed up a short while after the fire department did, and I showed them everything I'd found along with the booking under the guy's name. Officially, their investigation would involve looking for potential arson, but the cops told me they'd be looking into all these things I'd found too, if they ever caught the guy who tried to set the room on fire. That was pretty much the last I heard of it. The first few weeks that followed, I kept asking my uncle if they'd caught the guy. Each time the answer was the same, no. I tried telling him about my discoveries, but all he seemed to care about was the damage to the room itself. Besides, I was his hero having put the fire out and all, so whenever the subject came up, all I got was a slap on the back and a "that's my boy." It was hard to get any major details. What I'm left here with is a bunch of unanswered questions and half-baked theories as to what this guy was trying to do. There's one in particular that really sits with me. If the guy had a bunch of kids locked up somewhere, or if it was him trafficking children and he was trying to dispose of the evidence or something, that was a really dumbass way to go about it. Or maybe he was someone that had once been abused and was trying to draw attention to it in some way. Obviously, there's a lot to unpack here, but I really don't know what else to make of this creepy situation. I feel there's a deep, dark backstory to the whole thing, but I might never know what it is. Maybe in the years to come, the truth will come out, and I'll find out just what a crucial incident that motel fire was. Or maybe it'll remain a mystery forever, like so many other things in life. This is not my story as much as it is my mom's. She used to work at a motel in California back in the 80s. Anyway, one day a guy shows up to book a room. I'm going to just refer to this guy as the guest, since we don't know his actual name. My mom got assigned to clean his room on the daily, but as time went by, she noticed he always had the "Do Not Disturb" sign up on his room. Even a week into his stay, she'd never once had a chance to go inside and clean. This didn't really bother them too much though. The way my mom tells it, the guy was always super nice and friendly whenever he passed by someone or bumped into any of the cleaning staff, always apologizing for the trouble and telling them he'd just clean it up himself. If it saved them some work, they weren't exactly going to complain about it. Anyway, there came a point where the guy had not been seen for a few days on end, and the Do Not Disturb sign was not on the door anymore either. Everyone figured he just checked out, and they'd be able to clean the room again. It's a given that my mom was assigned to the room just like a month before. It came down to her to head over to clean it. As she got to the floor and unlocked the door to the room, a disturbing smell hit her immediately. She couldn't figure out what it was at first, but she continued to survey the room. Contrary to the guest's previous assurances, it was disgustingly messy. Her words were that it looked like someone had thrown a party, even though she was pretty sure no one else had ever gone into the room beside the guest. My mom was still shocked by the smell, so she tried to track down where it was coming from. As she followed it further in, she could tell now it was coming from the hotel room closet. When she opened the closet door, there was nothing but a wet-looking cardboard box on the ground. The smell then got way more intense, and she could tell it was coming from whatever was inside that box. She had a strong suspicion the guest had been using it to go to the bathroom in, so the last thing she wanted to do was look inside. Instead, she put on some gloves and covered up her nose and mouth, then picked the thing up to throw it into the trash. Only that's when she felt just how heavy it was. Way heavier than if there were just some feces inside or something. It was only when one of the other cleaning ladies smelled the same smell that they straight up yelled to call the cops right now. Apparently, a few years before, that very same cleaning lady had found a dead body in one of the rooms. Someone with a heart attack and a Do Not Disturb sign on the door. It took almost 2 weeks before they went in to investigate, and she knew it was the exact same kind of rotting smell, definitely not coming from anything else but a decaying body. They called the cops to come take a look at it. The cops showed up and cut open the box with everyone watching. The officer looked up to his partner with a numb expression, saying, "Call the coroner. We're going to 419. Someone had to explain to my mom that that code number was a code for dead body. Only it wasn't the whole body in there. That much was obvious because the box was way too small to hold an entire body. It turned out to be someone's decapitated head. I don't really know any more details than that. It happened almost 40 years ago now, and I couldn't find any internet archive stuff before I wrote this up. My mom said there was some talk of the head belonging to a call girl who had gone missing a few weeks before. They gave all the guy's info to the cops, but apparently that didn't help at all. The credit card was stolen, and the guy had used the same name on the card. Imagine being that person whose credit card got stolen, though. One day you think you've just lost it or something, and then suddenly the cops show up accusing you of having murdered someone. My mom stayed working at the motel for a year afterward, and only quit when she met my dad and moved into his place up in Vallejo. That story always kept me from ever wanting to work in a hotel or a motel or anything like that. No matter how desperate for money I get, I think I'd have to be very, very desperate to work somewhere you might see the darkest sides of human nature. Alright, I'll just start from the very beginning. I was around 12 years old when this happened. I'm 33 now, but thinking about what happened that night still gives me goosebumps to this day. For some context, I think I should mention that I grew up on a very large farm in the middle of nowhere in southern Idaho. It wasn't way out in the mountains like you might be thinking though. It was just nothing but grass and hills for miles on end. My mom and dad were both raised in big cities, so when they got married, they figured they'd give their kids more of a farm sort of life to grow up in, and I always loved it. We had goats, chickens, ducks, turkeys, you name it, we had it. The only thing I didn't have was much more freedom from my parents. My dad was a goat farmer, and his job was working on the farm. He sold goat milk, made cheese, and of course sold the meat as well. My mom was a stay-at-home mother, so she was around all the time, which basically meant I had no alone time and no privacy either. When I was little, I didn't really mind it that much. I loved having my parents around so often. I helped my dad with the farm work and taking care of all the animals. I was always in the kitchen baking and cooking with my mother. By the time I reached middle school, though, I was all ready to grow up. I guess I started doing what every kid does when they hit puberty. I started to pull away from my parents. It was hard, and my parents hated it, of course. I think they especially hated it because my brother was so much older than me, and he had already left the house by that point. I was their little baby girl, and they weren't quite ready for the teenager rebellious phase to hit yet. Every weekend, we would go out to dinner as a family. We would meet up with my brother and his girlfriend and have a lot of fun. This night, though, I really just wanted to stay home. My mom insisted I go with them, and when I refused, she offered to stay with me, so I wouldn't be home all alone. I begged and begged her, though, to just let me stay there by myself. Finally, after what felt like forever, she agreed. My dad wasn't all too happy about it, but she told him everything would be fine. Besides, if I needed anything, I could just call them anyway. They were only going to be about a 45-minute drive away in the city. Now all alone, for the first time in my life, I felt free. That night, my mom and dad gave me a big hug and a kiss and said their goodbyes. They gave me the rundown that all parents give when leaving their kids home alone for the first time. Cell phones, what restaurant they'd be at, calling 911 for an emergency, it all went in one ear and out the other. I was just looking forward to staying up late and watching shows I wasn't supposed to watch. You know, normal kid stuff. I should also mention we had a German Shepherd named Ghost at the time. He was an all-white German Shepherd, and I always thought he looked a bit more like a wolf. My parents got him when I was just a baby, and we'd grown up together. He was like my shadow. I'm sure having him around with me gave my parents some additional peace of mind when leaving me that night. They finally left at 7 p.m., and I was so excited. I heard my parents pull out of the driveway, and I jumped onto the couch in seconds. Ghost joined me, and we watched TV for a while. An hour went by and nothing of real significance happened. I used the opportunity to watch shows that my parents didn't normally allow, and deviously ate some candy I'd saved up from Easter a couple of weeks before. An important thing to mention is we didn't have any coverings on any of our windows. We lived in the middle of nowhere, so we weren't really worried about someone trying to peer in. My mom loved the morning sun shining in through the windows anyway, without her having to go around the whole house opening curtains or whatever. After it had been around an hour and a half since my parents left, my mom called to tell me they wouldn't be home when they'd originally said. My brother and his girlfriend wanted to see a movie with them that night. I was honestly super happy I'd be getting even more alone time. I told her it was fine and to go enjoy their movie. During one of the show's commercial breaks, I rushed into the kitchen to grab a bowl of ice cream when I heard Ghost starting to bark in the living room. I figured he'd just seen one of many bats that would fly around this time of night, so I didn't really give it much thought. Only this time he would not stop barking. It was getting so annoying that I even remember yelling at him to stop, but he just wouldn't let up. I walked into the living room, and I couldn't help but scream when I saw what Ghost was barking at. There was a man just standing there, right in front of the window. He was wearing this white rubber Halloween mask that had a huge painted smile on the front. I couldn't see his eyes, but it was insanely creepy. I froze in pure terror as I looked at this man. I could feel him staring back at me. Before I knew it, I was screaming at Ghost to follow me and running upstairs to my parents' bedroom. When I got to the stairs, I just couldn't help myself. I looked back. I had to know if he was still there. He was, only this time his hand was raised and he gave me a slow wave. His head tilted upward, so I was still in his view. I got into the bedroom and locked the door behind me. At this point, I was practically bawling. I regretted staying home alone. Now, all I wanted was my mom and dad. I rushed over to the nightstand and grabbed the landline to call my dad, only to find there was no dial tone. I wasn't too worried about it, considering my father had given me a cell phone to use in emergencies just like this. The only problem was that it was in my room across the hall, and I didn't want to go back to where the masked man could see me. I had no other options, though. It's not like I could just wait around for my parents to come back hours later. With this man skulking about the property, I mustered up every bit of courage I had. I unlocked my bedroom door and ran as fast as I could. In the 10 seconds it took me to get to my room, I noticed the man was not outside the window anymore. The window was open, and he was standing at the bottom of the stairs. I involuntarily screamed as loud as I could. I heard his footsteps beginning to run up after me. Ghost lunged toward the man, barking, which made him hesitate for a moment. That was just long enough for me and Ghost to get into my room and lock the door behind me. I grabbed the phone out of my drawer and dialed 911. The man outside my door began to jiggle the handle. I watched as he tried to get inside my room, the whole time never actually speaking a single word. I think that's what terrified me even more. The operator answered and barely understood me through my hysteria. She got the gist though, and told me that since an officer was already in the area, they would be there in only 5 minutes. She told me to stay on the line until he showed up. I repeated what she'd said out loud. Okay, so an officer will be here in 5 minutes? He'll be here in 5 minutes, right? The second I spoke those words, the jiggling stopped all at once. The handle stopped moving. For all I knew, he had completely fled the house. My heart was racing though. I knew I wasn't leaving that room until I was sure the officer was there to help me. Surprisingly, the officer took even less time to arrive than they'd initially stated. I saw the lights outside as he pulled up, and I heard the sirens as well. I heard the officer enter the house and run up the stairs, yelling for the man to get down and put his hands behind his back. That was confirmation to me that the man had never left. I'm so glad I didn't try to exit my room when I thought he had. They arrested the man and one of them took him away, while one of the officers waited with me. I guess they called my parents as well, who rushed home. They ended up finding multiple slain animals on our property, clearly been killed with stab wounds. When the police found him, he was just standing outside my door, staring at it with blood coating his body. He never even looked at them when they came in. The man never said why he did this either. He never actually spoke at all. After this period of time, we did find out that he was sentenced to 10 years in prison to our relief. My mom and dad thought of selling the farm and buying a different place after that traumatic event. Potentially even going to a state across the country where they were sure he would never find us if he did eventually get out, whatever his motivations may have been. The masked man ended up taking his own life in prison though before that could ever happen. To any child out there who wants freedom from their parents while they're still too young, just remember, in your scariest moments, they're the people you'll wish were there the most. I'm a fairly cautious individual. I always told myself I'd never be like other people who get themselves caught in dangerous situations. But that's exactly what happened. I'm a 28-year-old woman, and I currently live with my husband, Sam, and our 3-year-old daughter, Elena. My husband and I both grew up in the area, and when we got married, we decided a nice house on a lot of land would be perfect for us. We'd never exactly been the city living type, and we wanted our daughter to have a lot of space to play in. Over the 5 years that we lived here, we purchased a lot of farm animals off Craigslist. We started off with chickens, then pigs, then eventually goats even. Just over a year ago, I suggested to my husband that it would be nice to get a cow as well. We could milk her and she wouldn't have to have her calf taken away like most dairy cows. We felt we would be doing a good thing. After about 6 months with her though, we realized it was too much work to take care of her and her calf. We wanted them to go to a home that had the time to take proper care of them. I was sad about letting them go, but I knew it was the right thing to do. I suggested to my husband that we list her on Craigslist. He agreed it was a good idea, so I enlisted her immediately. We knew she would sell fast, given that she milked well and came with her calf too. With only a few hours of listing them, we'd gotten already 10 emails. We weeded out all the scams, and one person stood out to us. They said they had a 50-acre farm and other dairy cows too, so they had some experience. They also said they would pick her up themselves as soon as possible for the exact price we were asking. We were so happy they were going to go to such a good-seeming home. The only problem was, my husband was going to be out of town for work the next week. He told me multiple times he was not comfortable with a stranger coming to the farm when he wasn't going to be there. I was a little too trusting, I suppose, because I was positive it would be fine. The people in our area were all good people. I hadn't heard of anything bad coming from animal purchases in the area ever. The people who were coming told me they were a husband and wife pair named John and Betty. I do remember making a little joke to myself that these names were so boring that they almost sounded fake. The thought passed by though and didn't cross my mind again. I gave them our address and told them they could come pick up the cows the next day at around 4. That night, my husband gave my daughter and I a kiss and left for his long work trip. My husband was very serious when it came to leaving us two alone. We had set times we would call each other, and if I ever missed a call, he would immediately alert the police. That may seem dramatic to some people, but that was our routine, and it gave him peace of mind whenever he had to leave. I was more than okay with it because of this. The night came and went without incident. I woke up early at around 6 a.m. to let out all the animals to feed and give them water. They were excited to be out for the day, since it had rained the day before and they had been cooped up inside. Elena always went out with me in the morning. It was cute to see her interacting with all the different animals. I let the cows out for what I thought would be the last time. I rubbed their backs and essentially said my goodbyes. At around 1 p.m., I made Elena and myself something to eat and got her dressed in different clothes for the rest of the night. We sat down on the sofa and waited for 4 o'clock to arrive, when the pair would come to pick the cows up. Throughout the day, I'd done my routine calls with my husband to tell him how we were doing. And if I'm being completely honest, I started to regret letting strangers come to the house without him being there. I just started to have this really horrible feeling in the pit of my stomach that I just couldn't shake. John and Betty called me to say they were only 5 minutes away. I went out to the porch to greet them as they pulled up. I had just put Elena down for her nap, so I was completely alone out there. The first thing I noticed when they pulled up was the masks they were both wearing. I immediately ran back up the steps to my house before hearing one of them yell behind me, "No, no, no, you get back here now," in a very thick southern accent that was almost hard to understand. I felt something hard being pressed to my back, and I immediately knew it had to be a gun. I asked them with a shaky voice what they wanted, but I didn't have any cash. They quickly told me to shut up if I wanted to live, and to do exactly as they said. The woman, Betty, had a very raspy voice, almost like she'd been smoking for 40 years. I could tell she was also from the South. "You're gonna go inside and get every piece of jewelry you own. Put it in the bag and give it straight to me. John here is gonna get whatever he wants, and you won't put up a fight." The first thing I thought of was my daughter. I couldn't let them find Elena. I didn't know what these people were capable of. I told her I'd comply, but I already knew I wasn't going to. I really couldn't. I had to keep my daughter safe. I went inside my house, Betty close behind me as I walked toward the bedroom. My husband kept a shotgun under my bed. I knew if I could just get to it, I might be able to save our lives. "I keep my jewelry box under the bed. I need to get under there to grab it, okay? My voice was calm at that point because I was worried she was going to suspect something was up. Whatever, just give me what I asked for, she said. I could feel her spit landing on my face as she talked. She was missing most of her teeth. I wasn't exactly surprised, though. Disgusted, but not surprised. I got on my hands and knees on the floor and peered under the bed. There it was, only inches away. I knew I would have to act fast if I was going to get out of this without getting myself and my daughter killed. In as swift a motion as I could, I pulled out the gun from under the bed, and boom, without even aiming or thinking, I fired a shot. The force of the blow blasted Betty off her feet. Her chest was completely blown apart by the blast. The smell of gunpowder lingered in the room, mixed with the scent of her blood, splattered across my walls and floor. She was gone within seconds. I knew without a doubt John would come running in. It was a double barrel, so I'd only have one chance to take him out too. My adrenaline was pumping. I didn't even give a thought to this woman who had just died in my bedroom. All I could think of was keeping my daughter safe. John did come into the room, yelling for Betty. He took one look, and before I could even get a shot off, he was running down the stairs and out the door, screaming Jesus Christ over and over. His voice seemed to be cracking, maybe out of sadness. I ran to get Elena and carried her with me to the front porch, where we sat. The police showed up 30 minutes later, saying my husband had called and said something was wrong at the house. I hadn't called him at our scheduled time, so he knew something was up. I could barely talk, though. I swear I had gone into shock. I sat there with my daughter while the officers searched the house and found the body upstairs. As it turns out, of course, those names were fake. They were never able to identify the man, but the woman was someone the officers knew all too well around the area. She'd been arrested multiple times on drug-related charges. That day was the worst and most traumatizing day of my life. It also taught me a valuable lesson, though. Never assume strangers are worthy of trust, and never underestimate a mother's love for her child either. I'm a 17-year-old guy with a fairly interesting life, if I say so myself. My mom left when I was pretty young, and my sister and I had been raised by just our dad ever since. We live on a pretty large farm out in the Rocky Mountains, and life, for the most part, is very peaceful. I have some friends who live nearby, at least nearby by our standards. I would regularly make the 3-mile walk to their houses to hang out with them. So, when I asked my dad that night if I could go, he didn't even think twice about saying yes. I had made plans with my friend Jimmy to sleep over, and I was pretty damn excited. Plus, the walk was going to be gorgeous in the afternoon sun. I was 14 at the time, so when I packed my backpack for the journey, I only packed snacks, some Monster energy drinks, and some pajamas. I gave my dad a hug and kissed my baby sister on the forehead before heading out. The first part of the walk was just through some fields. I remember stopping every so often to take pictures with my disposable camera. I like to document the newly developing crops my dad and I had just planted. I regretted only wearing shorts and a tank top, though. As the sun beat down on my admittedly very pale skin, I could see myself turning red as the minutes passed by. At the end of our property was a small creek and some barbed wire fencing passing through it. We had it in place to try and deter the wolves and mountain lions in the area. We were sick of losing so many of our animals to them. It's technically illegal to set up wolf traps because it's considered inhumane, but my dad was so angry that he did so anyways. And that brings us to the worst night of my life. I passed through the barbed wire fence and through the creek as well. I'd made it about 40 or so feet into the forest before I heard a loud crunch and felt pressure on my ankle. I remember not understanding what that sound could have been and looking around for a possible source. I started to feel a burning sensation on my leg, and when I looked down, I saw one of the very large wolf traps clenched around and through my leg. The spikes had completely punctured through, and blood was oozing from between the wounds. I began to scream from the pain, hoping someone would hear me and help me out of this, but I was in the middle of the forest, with no one to help me for at least another mile. I felt myself getting lightheaded from the shock and blood loss. I couldn't allow myself to pass out though. This was a situation where I knew I would need all the time I could get, or else I'd bleed out. The only way out of this was for someone to find me, but that would also mean waiting a while. My dad didn't let me have a cell phone, so calling someone was out of the question. My only hope was Jimmy noticing I hadn't shown up and calling my dad. I took off my tank top and tied it around my leg to try and stop the bleeding. At this point, I could no longer even feel my toes. I couldn't feel my whole foot at all. I tried prying open the trap, but as a very skinny teenage boy, that was just not going to happen. I sat there for an hour, trying to figure out any way out of this. The only thing I could think of was to either wait for someone to notice I was missing, or muster up the courage and strength I had left in me to try and crawl back to my house, trap still attached. Thankfully, my dad's laziness was actually a good thing for once, as he'd not bolted the trap down. It started getting dark at that point, so I reached into my backpack and grabbed the pajama shirt I had packed. I put it on. I knew moving at night was not an option. I needed to see where I was going if I was going to drag this heavy trap attached to my leg as I crawled. I found a fairly large tree nearby, and in agonizing pain I crawled over to it. I propped myself up against it and couldn't prevent my eyes from shutting out of pure exhaustion. I woke up to the sound of snapping branches nearby. I looked around, but it was pitch black. I couldn't see anything. I took out my disposable camera and took pictures with the flash, pointing it in every direction to see what was out there. I shook in terror, though, when I saw two glowing eyes staring back at me in the distance, and heard howling. It was so loud I would have bet my life those wolves were standing right next to me. The night went on for what felt like days. I managed to stay awake until morning light started to peek through the trees. I was just relieved there were no longer any animals surrounding me. I had lost all movement in the lower half of my leg, but the pain was still there in full force. I slung my backpack onto my back and took a deep breath before getting onto my hands and knees and starting to crawl back. The weight of the trap dragging behind me as it pulled on my leg was almost unbearable. It felt like someone was trying to saw my leg off with a rusty butter knife. Every inch I moved felt like torture, but I had to press on. I had finally made it to the 40 feet of creek, but then I came to another obstacle. Sure, the creek was shallow enough to walk through with no problem, but crawling was another story. As I got closer to the water, I could see it was just deep enough to cover my mouth, and my only source of breath was through my nose. The water splashed as I crawled, and I would panic each time some of it shot up through my nostrils, thinking I was going to drown before I ever made it back to the farm. That wasn't the case, though. I made it through the creek and took deep breaths, relieved to have survived this part of the journey at least. I started to crawl through the barbed wire fence and screamed in pain when the trap got caught on a rock, basically cutting away at my leg as I unknowingly began pulling it apart. At that point, it started to feel hopeless. I contemplated just giving up. Surely I was going to die here. There was no way I'd be able to make it all the way home. In 4 hours, I'd only made it 50 feet. I lifted my leg from the rock and stared at the fencing in front of me. There was no way I was going to be climbing over. My only way was under. I tried lifting it up as I squeezed underneath, but there was nothing I could do to stop the barbs from digging into the skin on my back. The pain was bad, but it distracted me from the worst pain in my leg, as bizarre as that sounds. It gave me some relief, as inch by inch, I made my way closer to my house. Eventually, I was at the crops again, looking at those plants that I'd admired only the night before. Now they made me angry to even look at. It was a reminder of just how far away I was from home still. I was covered in dirt, sweat, and blood, but the second I could begin to see the frame of my house, I was determined to live. I began picking up the pace as best I could and dragged myself on my elbows, which were scraped and bloody beyond recognition. When I finally made it to the steps outside my house, my body was completely shot. The last thing I remember was my dad yelling when he found me. My leg had to be amputated, and I was in the hospital for a few months from the infections I ended up getting. My dad was fined for the traps and forced to dispose all the ones around the property. My friend had never even thought to call my dad that night. He just assumed I'd gotten in trouble and got grounded and continued on with what he was doing. He felt really guilty about that. I mean, I don't really blame him though. Even though the experience was horrible, I wouldn't change a thing either. It really showed me what it truly means to be alive, and I couldn't be more grateful for the lessons I learned that night. This memory of mine begins about 3 years ago, when I graduated from high school. I had grown up with my grandparents, but decided to move to a different and much larger city to live with my dad for the first time in 12 years. I'd went to the city already because I'd spent my summers with him, but this would be the first time I would have the freedom of an adult to come and go as I pleased, drive my car anywhere, smoke cigarettes whenever I wanted. I was excited. I was sad though to have to leave all of my friends behind. As soon as I was settled in, my dad and stepmom sat me down to discuss a few rules and what I needed to know about the basic things. Go whenever you want, but let us know when to expect you to leave and when to come back, even if it's at 2 a.m. so we know you're safe. You know, that sort of thing. I had to park on the street because the apartment complex had limited parking. They both told me to watch out for the neighborhood creep, whose name was George. He was well known to all the women in the complex, as well as the police that patrolled the area. He was tall and fairly huge. He looked very intimidating. My parents were pretty certain he would leave me alone for one reason. My dad thought George had a habit of stalking women in the complex, but he would always stop and find a new target if they had a man nearby. If they made a show of being at their place, be it a brother, a lover, or a father, it didn't matter who or what the man was to the woman. He would back off immediately. Since I was living with my dad, who was quite tall and very intimidating, we felt confident I would be alright. For a time, I was. It started about 6 months after I'd initially moved in. My stepmom and dad were fighting a bit at the time. Eventually, they separated. One night, I was on the porch having a cigarette and browsing Facebook or whatever. I wish I could say I felt like I was being watched, but I ended up just happening to look up coincidentally when I felt a bug land on me. George was standing 15 feet away, a little bit behind a tree, staring intently at me. I nearly dropped my cigarette in surprise. I shakily stubbed it out and went inside. I was home alone at this moment, so I made sure to lock all my doors. Then I started playing video games in my room to relax. I told myself I was probably just being paranoid. The next morning, I got up for a cigarette and some coffee. Lo and behold, only a few minutes after I'd stepped out onto the porch, George came ambling out of his apartment to look my way. I finished my cigarette and went back inside. This pattern continued for a couple of weeks on end. It was like George was always stood at his sliding glass door, peeking out and waiting to see when I would emerge. I told my dad about this, and he tried to sit down with me whenever I would smoke. If my dad was with me, George wouldn't so much as peek his head out the door. Of course, the other woman in the apartment complex had already tried to call the police about George. But since he lived there legally and staring isn't technically a crime, there wasn't much they could do. I didn't know how far George had taken it with the other woman before. With that info in my mind, I knew calling wouldn't be much use. Things slowly began to escalate once my stepmom left though. I had access to her parking spot now, so I had 3 ways to get from my car to the apartment, depending on how I chose to go. One of the ways went just past George's apartment, about 5 feet from his door. Since I got off late most nights, I avoided that route as much as possible. Slowly but surely though, he memorized my schedule. He would always be on one of these 3 paths when I was coming home. Not directly on the concrete, but a few feet away, hiding in the grass or behind a tree. It's like he really thought I couldn't see him. Almost like a child hiding very terribly behind an object. You could see 90% of his body. That's how he would always do it. I would rush past him and avoid eye contact, but prepare to scream if I heard him coming after me. I started to carry my keys between my fingertips, and I brought a pocket knife with me. I would walk from my car with it halfway open already, even though I'd never been in any fight before in my entire life. I believe it was around this time my mother was trying to find me free self-defense classes, since I couldn't afford anything with my tight budget. My dad was steadily getting more and more pissed off as George got closer and closer to escalating. As the days went by, it went from November to May. If my dad wasn't home, I would have to lock all the doors and keep my knife under my pillow. I would Skype all night with my boyfriend, just in case someone would need to call 911 for me. I put a bunch of flower pots in front of my bedroom window so no one could get inside silently. I started to sit on the floor of my porch below the wall so I would be out of sight whenever smoking. I would anchor myself though so I could see him if he ever tried to walk up to it. I had constant nightmares of me being kidnapped, raped, and murdered. They began to invade my dreams every night. One day, I was gossiping with my neighbor. "Hey, did you hear about George?" "No, what about him?" "He got arrested last night in the parking lot of the complex. There's this big sort of electrical power box that stands about waist height. It's about 2 or 3 feet wide. About 10 minutes before I was supposed to come home and park right in front of it, some lady and her kid were walking by. They saw George sitting behind the box masturbating. He was waiting there for me, jerking off to the thought of me seeing him. It kinda makes me want to puke, but it also scares me at the same time. I was relieved for a few days of my stress, but it was only a few days that he was gone. He went right back again to the same old routine soon after. One night he got even braver. It was about 7 p.m. I went out for a cigarette with my dad. A neighbor walked up to chat with my dad though. George came outside and stood out in the open staring me down. "Dude's asking to get his ass kicked," my dad said. He went back to chatting with the neighbor. I rolled my eyes and went back inside and played some more video games. I was healing in World of Warcraft when I heard my neighbor shouting. I was healing, and that's a pretty important job. I figured she must have been talking to someone else. That was until she burst into my room with panic in her eyes. Her eyes were huge. She hopped from one foot to the other frantically, like she was doing some kind of dance. "He's bleeding," she said. I asked who in bewilderment. "It's your dad. Come quick." I made some teenager huffing sound and left my computer, certainly pissing off the rest of my guild. I grabbed my little first aid kit and filled it with band-aids. I thought my dad was doing something stupid like tossing his knife and trying to catch it or something. But when I stepped outside, I found myself face to face with a real horror. 6 people were surrounding my dad, including my neighbor. My neighbor Caleb was holding a shirt to my dad's side, with my dad facing away from me. His entire back was covered in blood. It was like he'd just been mauled by a bear. Caleb's hold on the shirt slipped, and blood spurted out. I felt queasy writing this down. I had never before in my life seen an emergency like this. Blood makes me lightheaded, and I have anxiety attacks over not being able to find a specific bookmark. All the adults around me were panicked aside from Caleb. I threw the first aid kit onto the porch and told everyone where we kept our towels. Shell rushed inside to grab one. "Has anyone called 911?" I shouted. 5 pairs of eyes turned to look at me, like they'd never heard of 911 before. My dad shouted he couldn't afford an ambulance, but I told him to shut the fuck up. He told me that the guy had stabbed him. I dialed 911 and we told them our address and the reason for the emergency. My dad was being a real champ, even though he was spurting out blood all over the sidewalk. I ran back and forth along the walkways to get the police and show them what house George lived in. Then I ran back and forth to get the paramedics. They were so agonizingly slow. They walked calmly, and I wanted to scream at them that my dad was bleeding out. They got my dad packed into an ambulance. I was about to jump in when the police stopped me and told me I had to stay, so I could give them a statement. My dad shouted at me to call his boss. 2 years later, and all these memories are still burned into my brain. I gave my statement to the police. Then they made me sit outside the complex on the sidewalk for 2 to 3 hours. They kept me updated on my dad. Once I'd called my boss and answered my stepmother's message, that's when I allowed myself to break down. It felt like I'd cried on forever. One of the cops was nice enough to go into my house and grab my cigarettes and a bottle of water for me. He stayed with me the entire time to make sure I didn't run off or something, but he was very nice. He even offered to let me sit in his cruiser a few times to get me away from George. He had been waiting in his apartment when they came. When they took him out, I was there. 14 cops were leading him away. He still kept trying to stare at me though. I stared back and felt such hatred I'd never felt before in my entire life. I wanted to go over there and murder him. My babysitting cop looked over and saw George staring at me, so he shined his flashlight in George's eyes to keep him from looking at me. Once it was all over, I was allowed to go back into my house, where I waited for more information about my dad. He was in the hospital for 9 days. Apparently, he shouted at George to leave me alone, and George had started shouting back at him while I was in the house. George had screamed at my dad to face him like a man, so my dad jumped over the porch and walked up to him. This creep had been waiting with a 12-inch blade held to the side of his leg, which he struck out and stabbed my dad in the back with. The knife missed his kidney very narrowly. It traveled up and punctured his diaphragm. My dad didn't even realize he'd been stabbed at first. He got George into a headlock and beat the shit out of him, thinking the dude had just punched him in the back or something. George dropped the knife, then rolled in the grass and picked up another knife he'd been hiding and stabbed my dad again. This time, it was an upper back wound that was much more shallow, but still required stitches. This is when all the rest of the stuff went down. The blood stayed on the pavement until about noon the next day, when one of my neighbors kindly washed it off for me. My dad spent more time in the hospital in critical condition than George spent being held in jail. I felt like it was all my fault. I'd been addressing that in therapy, but I feel awful about what happened to my dad. Throughout the week, while I was on the porch or even just outside, many women came up to me and told me they had to thank my dad. All of them had been terrorized by George at some point, and now they were certain he would be put away for good after his trial. Several women, George had even stalked them up to their apartment door and pull his pants down demanding sex. I can't believe the cops didn't do anything. One day, one of my neighbors came up to me and told me that police and neighbors had searched the complex and found that George had stashed many knives all over the place, buried in gardens, stuck in trees, under his doormat. I shudder to think that maybe one day he planned to grab one of his targets and do something far more sinister than stare. George was declared guilty for assault with a deadly weapon, but the attempted murder charge was dropped. He was out of prison by Christmas on good behavior or whatever. My dad and I have a lifelong restraining order against him. He's never again tried to come after me, so I can only hope he's terrified of my dad. I wish I could tell you guys I took a self-defense course and learned how to fight like my dad did, but I'm still a bit of a punk who can't even slap a spider, so there's that. My dad's doing okay now. I probably owe my life to him. If he hadn't fought George for me, I might have been the first victim George decided to stab. About 4 years ago, one of my work colleagues asked me to dog sit and watch over their house while they were out of town for a few nights. I was decently close with this coworker, so I told them it wouldn't be a problem at all. I'd love to do it actually. I had met their dog Candy on a few occasions and knew I would have no problem being with her for a few days. She could be a little hyper, but usually pretty low maintenance. I figured if I just brought her a new toy, it would distract her for most of the time. I packed a small bag and went over a little bit early so I could get all the details they wanted me to do before they left. Where the dog food was, how often she was to be fed, where her harness and leash were, etc., etc. They had a security system, but they decided they would leave it off while they were gone, so I didn't have to worry about it every time I came and left during the day. They lived in a nice neighborhood anyway. Obviously, I would still lock the doors though. There was a dog living there. I really had no need for the security system to actually be on. She did let me know that even when the system wasn't armed, if the doors opened, you would hear a faint chime. That was the security box letting you know one of the doors had been opened. After getting the rundown, they were off on their trip. I was outside hanging out with Candy the first night. It was fairly uneventful, outside of Candy occasionally trying to eat some grass and dirt. She was perfectly well behaved and even came and laid down with me on the couch when she got tired. I was a little bit annoyed with myself though that I'd brought her a new toy, which so happened to be a squeaker. After 2 hours, I thought I was going to go insane. I didn't sleep well that night either. Something about being in someone else's home alone just couldn't make me relax. Candy couldn't figure out where she wanted to sleep, so she was going up and down in the guest bed to the bed with me, which wasn't really allowing me to get comfortable. The first night came and went. Soon enough, it was already my last evening staying at the home. I remember it was getting kind of late, and I wanted to get some pizza. I ordered it on my phone and ran out to pick it up. I came back and put on the TV. There I was, enjoying my pizza and breadsticks. Before I knew it, the sun was already down, and I was starting to doze off on the couch with Candy. She seemed to be very restless though, which she hadn't been at all before. I figured maybe she needed to go out to the backyard, but when I opened the door to let her out, she just stared out into the backyard and started to whine. She wouldn't go out. She wouldn't go outside, even when the motion light turned on. I didn't close the door right away though, so the faint chiming from the security system was going off to let me know the door was open. I went to go get Candy a treat to see if I could calm her down. I moved her harness and leash out of the way and grabbed her a treat, which she looked very excited about. Her tail was wagging like crazy. I realized it was because she'd heard the jingling from her leash and wanted to go on a walk. It was late and I wasn't sure if I should take her. But if she had to go to the bathroom and wouldn't go in the backyard anyway, I figured I would just take her on a quick walk and calm her down. I almost fell down the stairs trying to lock the front door while she was pulling me in the opposite direction. I started walking down the street, as I wasn't super familiar with this area. I noticed that down the road there seemed to be a park, or at least an area with some open grass. The streetlights gave me a little bit of guidance in the dark. As soon as we went to the grassy area, Candy stormed around and then went to the bathroom. I was relieved and thought this was definitely what she'd needed. As I was done picking up after her, I noticed her ears were raised and she started to whine again. Her whine turned into a low growl. I asked her what was wrong and looked toward where she was looking. There was a person sitting on one of the park swings all by themselves. The park itself wasn't lit, but some of the area around it was being lit by streetlights. The person wasn't moving or swinging at all. They were sitting still as they could, staring in our direction. The only thing I really remember is they had some sort of striped outfit on. The pants and shirt were vertically striped, almost like you'd see on a clown or something. I pulled on Candy's leash to try to get her to move, but she was stuck in place. I shouted under my breath, "Candy, let's go!" As she looked back at me, the person stood up from the swing, staring in our direction. Candy started to bark, and I started walking back towards our house. Even though I was very far away from the swings, I remember starting to jog just to try and get out of there. I wanted to get back to the house as quickly as possible. Once we got back, I gave her another treat and figured we would sit down on the couch. She got into her little dog bed nearby with her toy and laid down, while I put the TV on and started scrolling through my phone. About a half hour later, I kept feeling like I was hearing something, like music maybe. I couldn't quite put my finger on it. It was nagging at me, so I walked out to the kitchen and realized it was the security alarm unit chiming and saying the back door was open. My heart sank. Why was this door open? I remembered when I'd tried to let Candy out in the backyard before. I guess I'd forgotten to close it all the way and lock it. That definitely was against my nature even at my own house. I always locked and closed my doors as soon as I got inside out of habit. I closed and locked the door and started to walk back to the living room when Candy was already in the kitchen. She was whining and kind of half growling, barking the exact same as she had earlier at the park. She turned her attention to the stairs leading down to the basement and started full-on barking. As I tried to calm her down, I noticed the light switch to the basement didn't seem to be working, or at least the switch wasn't turning a light on. I walked back to the living room, then went back to the basement stairs after calming Candy down a bit. I turned on my phone light to try and mitigate some of the darkness, and heard what I could only describe as a laugh. I didn't know how else to describe it. I remember turning around and booking it up the stairs, grabbing Candy and running outside. Not knowing what else to do, I called my friend from work and told her what happened. She said she would phone the police and let them know there was an incident, and that I was house-sitting. They could expect me to be there. About 20 minutes later, the police showed up and did a walkthrough of the house and property. They didn't find anything, but they did say the back door was slightly ajar and unlocked. I told them that it had 100% been locked, as I remembered doing it less than an hour ago. They gave me a number and said if anything else out of the ordinary happened to give them a call. I called my friend and filled her in, and apologized for having them worry while they were away. She said they would be home first thing in the morning, and walked me through how to set the alarm for the remainder of the night. I made it through the rest of the night with no other strange occurrences, and I never did get any answers as to exactly what happened. You know that feeling where you see something you're not supposed to, and then you have to live with that knowledge haunting the back of your mind afterwards? I certainly do, and that feeling's been clawing at my skull every time I pass by the old farmhouse at the edge of town for the past 15 years. I remember it very well, the night my life changed altogether. It was Halloween night, squarely in the year 1997, and I was 15 years old. I was wearing a white dress and a cheap blonde wig that really stood out in the nighttime, something I'd come to regret later. I also had a little mole made out of eyeliner. You can probably guess who I was trying to be that year, but I digress. Not even Marilyn Monroe could save me from what was coming. I was super excited to go trick-or-treating, as were my girlfriends. We decided on a collective theme of quirky Hollywood stars. I was Marilyn, while Janice donned a classic Dolly Parton look, and Carly took the visage of namesake Carly Simon. We giggled and primped ourselves up, as if we were going out to a red carpet premiere, rather than just a stroll across town. We were having a lot of fun, though. After a quick goodbye to my parents and a reminder to be home by 10:30, we took on the town at sunset. The sky was a deep purple, and deep pinks on either side as we walked. Janice liked to pretend the streetlights blinking above us were in fact spotlights turned on just for us, and kept striking poses as we walked along. It really slowed us down a lot, but we didn't really care that much. Candy was great, sure, but really we were there to enjoy spending time with each other before Carly moved away in November. It was only going to be a few towns away, so she wouldn't be gone forever or anything. but still it was a break in routine that really saddened 15-year-old us. That's when Janice suggested, after a pose that had her almost falling off the curb, that we go to the old farm at the edge of town and tell some ghost stories. That's what we always used to do at sleepovers together, and it was rumored that the old farm, especially the barn area, was haunted by all sorts of spooky entities, most often claimed to be farm cats that had starved to death when the farm was abandoned due to bankruptcy in the 1950s. In other words, the perfect setting for a last hurrah of ghost stories. Carly protested though and said we should not. Surely we'd get in trouble if we were to get caught. I took Janice's side though. After all, it was going to be our last night for a while. Besides, who would be lurking around at such an old place at night anyway? Carly reluctantly agreed after some convincing. I was never a rebellious kid myself, but the air was crackling with excitement. We made our way over, stopping at a few houses to collect some candy along the way. I remember an older couple gushing at our costumes and asking us to sing and dance like they remembered on TV. They even gave us a few extra lollipops each, if I remember. After dealing with the old couple and digging into a cherry lollipop, I noticed another trick-or-treater down the road, coming from the direction of the old farm. They were featureless, save for a plain hoodie and a simple creepy clown mask. It had sharp blue triangles around the eyes and a garish red nose. They walked with a purpose, though not towards us specifically. Rather, it was like they were walking rather quickly away from something else. Maybe they were another kid hurrying to make curfew or something. They carried a bag hiked over their shoulder, an old pillowcase-looking thing really. It was bulging full of what I assumed was candy. I thought about greeting him, but instead settled on a friendly Marilyn-esque wave as he passed by. Janice and Carly were too absorbed into the conversation to really spare anything else their attention. I noticed something peculiar about the case he was carrying, though. A dark stain seemed to be stretching across one of the seams and slowly dripping out onto their shoulder. I nearly choked on my damn lollipop, but I reasoned it was probably just an elaborate prop, quite an effective one at that, especially in this low lighting. I shook off any morbid thoughts with another lick and joined my friends. I didn't look back. We arrived at the farmhouse first, and it looked just as derelict and desolate as we'd heard. A large collapsed-in porch, plants creeping up all the walls, peeling paint, old furniture scattered around the yard leading out to the cornfield. The whole works. Janice sat down on a sun-faded couch leaning up against the side of the house. She picked out a spot of grout on the cushion beside her and said, "Let's get started," her voice taking on an air of mischief. "Wait," I said. Goosebumps prickled across my arms, and I regretted not bringing a jacket on this cold night. "Don't you guys want to look around first? I mean, we can find the perfect spot. It's hella cold out here." "Guys, seriously," Carly interjected. "Hanging in the yard is one thing, but we're gonna get in serious trouble if we go inside. I mean, what if there's mold or rats in there?" "Come on, Carls," Janice teased, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "It won't be that bad. It's just gonna be a couple of minutes. We'll just look for a few minutes and then come right back out, okay?" I felt a twinge of guilt for making her do this, but I knew that once we proved nothing bad was going to happen, she'd enjoy it all the same. She gripped my hand as we stepped up onto the creaking porch. Well, the strip that wasn't collapsed at least. Janice was the brave one to open the door. A wave of dust immediately hit me in the face, and I coughed. My throat was dry. The interior of the house seemed untouched almost for 3 decades. We made our way from the parlor room to the living room to the kitchen, all covered in the same dust and old mildewy wallpaper. We kind of regretted not bringing a camera with us. Carly seemed to have calmed down quite a bit, and even let go of my hand at this point to examine some old china in the cupboards. It was incredibly dark except for what little moonlight filtered in through the windows. Maybe that's why we didn't see it at first, and why we didn't panic either. I remember facing the round kitchen table in the center of the room, when a bit of moonlight shone in through the window, and that's when I saw it. Handprints in the layer of dust coating the table. Fresh ones. My mind immediately flashed back to that clown guy we'd seen walking earlier, and a shiver shot up my spine. I didn't really know what to think at first. I stood there in dead silence staring at these markings until Janice broke the tension in the air. I ran over and saw a bunch of tiny tracks along the floor. They looked to be from the fabled farm cats, sliding and skidding along the ground or something, maybe trying to get away from something. "Is it the ghost cats?" Carly piped up. "Come on, ghosts don't leave footprints. Maybe it's a family of cats or something. Come out, kitty." She went off to search for them, crouching low to the ground. I probably know what you're thinking. Why didn't I tell them about those handprints right away? Well, at the time, I guess I didn't want to ruin our fun. It's stupid, I know, but that's the logic a 15-year-old on Halloween night would have. Instead, I gathered Janice and steered us to check out the barn. Maybe all those cats could be in the barn catching mice or something. As we made our way through the darkened house, I tried to keep the thoughts of another person watching us from a darkened doorway at bay, very badly. I now found myself squeezing Carly's hand and trying to rationalize my thoughts away. Maybe it was simply a squatter that had packed up ship and moved on. The barn was situated a little ways off from the house, and was in even worse shape from what we could see. The paint had faded from a deep red to a brownish rust color, and the door was propped open from the hinges, perfect for a family of wild animals to hide. Nothing could have prepared us for what was inside that barn, though. We ducked under the gap in the door. I felt for any source of light, an old lamp or a flashlight or anything, and I ended up pulling on a cord. A single light bulb attached to a rafter illuminated the space. At first, it just looked like a normal barn, if an empty one. The stalls were demolished and gutted out. Hay was scattered all over the place and crunched beneath our shoes. What had me frozen in place, though, was the deep red stain streaking up and down the walls and pooling onto the floor. Janice screamed and Carly took off out the door. Janice and I weren't so lucky. We stuck around and observed long enough to see a bloodied cat's head peeking out from a pile of hay. The flesh at the back of its eye sockets gleamed up at us, suggesting its eyes had been gouged out. The rest of the night was a blur. We took off running down the road, all thoughts of a fun Halloween with my best friends forgotten. What had remained in its place was sheer terror, tears, and a lot of screaming. Like I mentioned earlier, my dress whipped in the wind, and my hair shone like a highlighter in the darkness, something I really regretted in my panic. A new dread formed in the pit of my stomach as I thought about that masked butcher from earlier following my hair all the way home, or chasing us down right then and there. Thankfully, though, no such thing happened. The lights shining through my windows were a welcome sight, and we all but collapsed after running inside and slamming the door behind us. My parents were initially upset with me for missing my curfew, but once they saw the tears streaming down my face and that we were all out of breath, they quickly changed gears to concern. They asked what happened, and we explained the entire story. Dad wanted to call the police, so that's exactly what we did. The police couldn't do anything, though, because we couldn't prove who'd committed the crime. As for trespassing, they let us off with a warning. My parents made us promise not to do anything like that again, or we'd be grounded for life, and the police went on their way. That night, I laid tossing and turning, thinking about that clown trick-or-treater we'd seen, and about that bag he held. I kept imagining all those bulges that peeked out of that pillowcase. That blood no longer seemed like a fake smear for dramatic effect. Carly, Janice, and I didn't talk about the experience for a while afterward. After her family moved, Carly's dad told my dad that Carly would stay up and cry sometimes, citing those poor cats left to the butcher clown. Whenever we met up, we would try our best not to mention it. Like I said though, it was always there in the back of my mind. Every time the leaves fell, every time I would see a stray cat loitering around the neighborhood, every time I'd see a damn clown mask in a store's Halloween section, I'd imagine that night. Hi. For simplicity's sake, my name is Amy, and I'm a 23-year-old girl living near Chicago, about 20 minutes away from the main city. As any single young woman living in or around a major city in any region of the world knows, you meet your fair share of strange characters in the dating scene. Sometimes you'll meet awkward but ultimately very nice folks you just don't feel a spark with. Other times you'll meet jerks or creeps. Usually there's not much in between. There's one date I went on though, that I met a real clown on, literally, and not the smiley red nose doing flips at the circus kind. I mean the scary motherfucker from Stephen King's It type. Before I delve into it though, a little bit of backstory. I grew up in the backwoods of rural Maine, where little else happened other than a cow breakout because of a thunderstorm or something. I spent my days languishing in the winter weather and rainy summers, wanting my 18th birthday to come around already so I could move off to college. I wanted a place where things were busier, more exciting, and eventually settled on the Windy City. It was somewhat less expensive than New York, but much more accessible than where I already lived. If I wanted thrilling, I certainly got more than I bargained for. I was fortunate enough to find a small 2-bedroom with another girl named Guinevere. She was pretty awesome. She helped me learn how to navigate the busy streets and the people that inhabit them nearly every day. There was so much more to do here than where I grew up too, and I relished every minute of it. Playgrounds, swimming pools, bird sanctuaries, all within walking or busing distance. Even when the initial novelty of moving to a new place wore off, the feeling of becoming an adult and realizing I belonged in the city life remained. However, one aspect of my time in Chicago that was not so exciting was my love life. Before I moved out of my hometown, I'd had all these fantasies of bumping into my true love in a coffee shop or stumbling into them on the street. I'd spill caramel flavoring on their fancy suit jacket and they'd laugh. I'd help them clumsily clean it up, etc. He wouldn't stop thinking about me whenever he smelled caramel and desperately tried to find me again. It's cliché, but that was the sort of hopeful I was. The concept of dating apps seemed foreign and honestly quite scary to me, so I put off using them for as long as possible and continued to scout out coffee shops for the next 3 years. As you might imagine, my fantasies did not play out. I finally decided to take the plunge into apps when Guinevere got into a long-term relationship, recommending a site called Tinder. After quite a bit of trial and error, I started to get the hang of it. I had a few conversations with guys who lived across the city by this point, but they didn't really go anywhere beyond the initial, "Hey there." That's when I got a new message from someone, a local guy named Caleb. It just said, "Hey, I think you're really pretty. Would you like to chat with me?" I'll be honest, I was quite intrigued. This formal way of asking was quite different, and his profile picture was that of a good-looking guy with a nice smile. I messaged him back pretty soon. "Hey, thanks. How are you tonight?" We spent most of the night talking after that, and the day after, and the day after that too. Slowly, the conversation escalated past all the small talk, and he eventually opened up to me about his unusual job. He worked part-time as a clown for children's birthday parties. He even sent me a couple of pictures of him with one of those wearable noses and in all the face paint. I didn't mind. I thought it was pretty fun. He proved he had a sense of humor, too. This was exactly the sort of lively experience I'd been expecting. After only about a week of texting, he asked me to meet up for coffee. He even joked around with me. "I'll bring my nice shirt so you can spill something on it." I was elated. I told Gwen where I'd be that coming Saturday. and she told me to call her halfway through to update her. I promised that I would. Off I went, fantasizing all throughout the days leading up to the date. Carefree conversations, maybe even a kiss or two. The day finally arrived. We settled on a small cafe halfway in between our two places. Since it was getting much colder, I picked out a nice sweater and my favorite pair of warm boots. When I arrived at the cafe, the warm embrace of the building's heat made me shiver. I was already mulling over my choices for what to drink as I made my way to the line in front of the counter. Caleb didn't seem to be there yet, so I figured I'd have time to situate myself and gather my nerves. That was until a hand touched my arm from behind. I spun around, ready to say, "Excuse me," but I stopped when I saw who it was. Caleb put his hands up in mock surrender. I didn't know why, but for some reason, as soon as he touched me, the last thing I wanted to do was be near him. "Oh, God, he scared me," I said, brushing it off with a laugh and dispelling that feeling. "Sorry, I just couldn't resist." He flashed me a toothy grin and went to sit down at a table in the corner. I ordered and joined him. Conversation flowed just as well as it did over text, but there was just something about him in person that seemed kind of off. I figured it was just last-minute nerves, but that feeling wouldn't let up. He asked me about my job, my family, my roommate. I found myself giving much more vague answers than I'd expected. I told myself to relax as I sipped on my coffee. The topic of his side job came up again, and I felt the tension in my shoulders leaving. Finally, he'd started to talk a bit about himself instead of just bombarding me with questions. Hopefully, my nerves would start to go away from this point on, but what he said next definitely caught me off guard. I love meeting new kids as Chuckles. Their faces just light up. Do you have any siblings? Nieces or nephews with a birthday coming up, perhaps? It was a nice gesture to meet my family with, but at the same time, we'd only just met in person right now. It was moving a little too fast for me. I lied and said no. I did have a little 5-year-old niece who'd be turning 6 in a couple of weeks, but that wasn't something to tell someone you'd just met. Caleb seemed a bit flustered, but moved on to the next topic fairly quickly. Finally, I thought the butterflies were going to start fluttering. Except they never really did. We went for a walk after coffee to a nearby park. He did all the things right. He laughed at my jokes, held my hand, put his respectfully on the small of my back whenever someone took up the walkway. But still, even after all this, I couldn't shake this feeling of nervousness. I decided to call Gwen to pick me up early, as I'd promised to call her halfway through. I made up an excuse of my cat needing to go to the vet, and got out of there. Caleb seemed genuinely surprised, and said he'd call me later. Gwen thought it was absolutely hilarious, and based my discomfort on clown jitters. I wasn't quite so sure, though. Caleb continued to message me after, but I would always wait until I felt like I couldn't keep putting off replying. I decided to do a little bit of research, looking for his business online. After all, simple word of mouth as an entertainer can only get you so far. You'd obviously have to advertise it somewhere. What I found shocked me. Rather than a little website or Facebook post advertising his party service, I found news article after news article with titles like "Man Fakes Clown Business, Arrested for Inappropriate Contact with Children," "Chicago Man Arrested from Molesting Child at His Birthday Party After Being Hired as a Clown," and most worryingly of all, "Fake Clown Accused of Molesting Children, Bailed Out." I felt sick. I felt like bile was rising in my throat. It's a wonder that I didn't throw up all over my phone when it beeped, and I saw a notification from Caleb come through. "I know you lied. I'd like to visit your niece in 2 weeks, Amy." I immediately blocked that son of a bitch and called my brother, my parents, anyone I could think of. I left at least 3 messages on my brother's phone alone. I sent him all the links just to be safe. I burst into Gwen's room and showed her the message and the articles. She told me I needed to make a report in the morning. That's exactly what I did. Gwen took me down to the police station. and I told the officer everything I discussed with Caleb, what he'd said during our date, and the message he'd left me. The officer was very patient and kind. She said I did the right thing by coming in and informing my brother, and that she'd be giving me a call if they found anything new. My brother was grateful as well. He called me the next morning saying that Caleb had tried to get hired for the niece's birthday party. He'd reported him to the police in their town as well. My parents called me too, and were glad I was safe. I never heard from Caleb again, and I took a break from Tinder for quite a while. Fortunately, the officer did call me back and say he'd been arrested again, so hopefully he won't be finding work at another child's birthday party anytime soon. It's funny, I expected to go on a date with a few clowns, but I never thought I'd find one like this. In my experience, working a haunted house is good, clean, scary fun. Some years I've been a ticket master, sometimes a person who breaks up the groups going into the attractions. This year though, 2018, my senior year of high school, I got to be an actor in our fun house, or scream house so to say, attraction. The experience was so different from what I was used to. Instead of greeting people in the usual customer-friendly sort of way, I'd be setting out to scare them, or at least give them the creeps, as our haunted houses didn't have the highest budget in the world. For this role, I'd be playing an it type of clown. You know, red balloon, sharp needle-like teeth, all that jazz. I don't know if our local Halloween fair committee violated any copyright laws, but I wasn't about to be asking any questions. What I found most challenging about the role, ironically enough, was how to be scary, really. I was never really one to pull pranks or anything like that on Halloween. Hell, the scariest costume I'd ever dressed up as was a cliché bedsheet ghost. I really hated seeing kids cry, and so I really struggled at our practice sessions. Worse still, I'd be at the very end of the house, the final scare before people leave. I had to make an impression that would last. Other folks playing roles and our casting director would bring their kids in the weeks leading up to the fair and go through each attraction, giving feedback at the end on what we could do better. I was, for a lack of a better word, quite terrible. Although I looked the part through no magic of my own, I lacked the bite that this sort of thing is supposed to have. The dread in the pit of your stomach that forms when people think of those clowns when watching movies. Personally, I blame Tim Curry and Bill Skarsgård for being such tough acts to follow, but I digress. I watched the movies religiously in my spare time and tried my best to emulate the behavior. According to the director though, my performance was now lacking subtlety and individual flair. Yeah, because people going to a county haunted house look for subtleness in their scares. I turned to online horror for more examples, as well as looking for some acting tips. Some short films on YouTube were helpful in the opening, the kind where you stand still and just stare at the patrons. Others gave me a brand new perspective on how a scary clown should act. I became kind of obsessed with scary videos, aside from research. Going down long rabbit holes into the night. Going down long rabbit holes late into the night after my family had gone to bed. That's not the point of this story though. The point happened on a fair night a few days in. The director said I had improved a lot in that time. I was feeling good at the creeped out looks on patrons' faces as they left. I felt a little bit bad when I made a little girl cry though. I tried to mask it with a sinister, in-character grin as she and her parents went on their way. The sun had long since set, and I'd managed to make a few good tips for the funhouse by the end of the night. They had a tip bowl by the exits for anyone who wanted to give a little something extra for the budget for next year. After the last few patrons had gone, the other actors and I filtered out of the attraction to go home ourselves. There were haunted dolls, marionettes, mirror ghosts, even the odd crazy jester or two. But I was the only creepy clown performer. In hindsight, this made me really easy to identify later. The grounds in which our fair took place were sectioned into 3 parts: the attractions, the food area, and the parking lot way off to the side. I didn't have a car at the time, so I had to walk all the way across town at midnight just to get home. All alone. Yeah, I know. It wasn't the best feeling after performing in a haunted house all night and watching so many scary movies, but it's not like I had a choice. At least my folks would leave the light on and the door unlocked. I started down the block with no issues, and quite a lot of bravado. After all, I was still wearing the scary clown costume. The makeup had cracked a bit, and my skin was itchy and uncomfortable, but I didn't feel like anybody would want to be approaching me so late at night. I'd plugged in my headphones at this point, so I only saw the car when it passed by me on the street, rather than hearing it coming. It was a dark, ambiguous color in the inky darkness, and low to the ground. What stood out to me most was that it had stripped tires, or whatever those are called, not very common in our area. It moved slowly through the suburbs. It was late at night, so maybe they wanted to be careful. I know I would've if I was driving. What made me scared shitless, though, was when the car slowed down to a stop, circled back around, and came by to pass me again, even more slowly this time. I ripped my headphones off my head and tried not to panic. Maybe they were taking a wrong turn. Maybe they wanted to ask for directions. Maybe. But hell no. The car circled back around 3 more times, sometimes speeding up, sometimes slowing down again. I began to sweat through the makeup and began to speed walk, as much as I could in this bulky clown costume at least. I soon came to the corner parallel to my street. All I had to do was turn this corner and book it to my house down the road. But as I turned the corner, the car still followed me, and a new terrifying thought shot through my head. I don't want them to know where I live. Oh God, what do I do? I was already on my street. Obviously, they'd see what house I was going to, but I couldn't just keep walking aimlessly. Who knows what they'd do to me once they were finished toying with me? Gathering my courage, I remembered an old-school survival horror tip from one of my rabbit hole videos. Act crazier than they are. I swear to God, I hope this works, I thought to myself. Just as the car slowed down to pass me again, I whipped around and screamed, slamming my fists into their driver's side window as hard as I dared to. With the white and red makeup and freaky-looking prop teeth, I guess I was more terrifying than they'd expected. While I couldn't make out any distinct features in the dark, I could clearly see the whites of the driver's eyes widen. The car jerked to a stop, squeaking as it hit the curb. I didn't care. I just kept screaming and laughing as I pounded the door, window, and windshield over and over, as if I really was a crazed demonic clown trying to get in. The car sped off in a hurry, and I even chased it to the next house, all to make sure they'd stay well and truly gone. My lungs hitched, and my body buzzed with adrenaline. I'd never felt so scared or so alive in one night. The energy drained away as soon as I reached my own house, though, leading me to crash on the living room couch and sleep for the next 17 hours. I guess acting absolutely batshit for the sake of your life can do that to you. My dad shook me awake the next afternoon and asked me if I had a tough night. I'd surely tell him later, but he had no idea at the time. What is up, guys? Blue Spooky here. Thank you guys so much for watching, especially if you made it this far to the end of the video. If you liked the video, please be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you feel so inclined. If you have any feedback for me as well, be sure to leave that in comments below the video. If you guys have a story you'd like to send in, or if you'd like to contact me for any reasons, there will be links to my social media in the description below the video, including my Facebook, Gmail, and Twitter accounts. Go ahead and send me a message on any of those, and I'll try to get to you as soon as possible. If you do decide to send in a story, Please be sure to include in the tagline what the name of the story is if it has one, what type of story it is if it has one, and how you'd like to be credited in the description below the video. Please make sure to include as much detail as you feel comfortable with and try to use as much proper grammar as possible to make sure you have the highest chance of appearing in a future video. Overall, I think that's pretty much it for now, guys, so thank you so much for watching, and I hope you guys have a great day.